It was close to midnight in Portland, and the kind of rain falling offside wasn't dramatic, just that quiet, annoying northwest drizzle that sneaks under your collar and makes the whole world look like a wet photograph. I sat in the passenger seat of the ambulance, gloves on, legs tired, shoulders slouched, pretending that I wasn't just counting the minutes until the shift ended. Portland nights have their own personality. Quiet, but not peaceful. Like the city is holding its breath, waiting for something weird to happen. The sirens were faint somewhere far off, the streets glowing with reflections from neon and traffic lights, and Vic, my driver for the night, glanced over and smirked like he already knew we weren't getting home on time. I told him Portland nights were like bad dates. Too quiet, and just when you think it's over, someone throws you a curveball that ruins the rest of your night. That's when the radio crackled to life, and the curveball came. Unit 47, medical emergency, Artemis Country Club, possible anaphylaxis, adult male, conscious but going downhill fast. I didn't even have to think. Muscle memory took over. I grabbed the radio, answered, and felt the shift in the air as Zena, my partner in the back and professional caffeine addict, snatched up the trauma kit. The siren came alive, the wipers fought the mist, and we shot through the sleeping city toward one of the richest hills in Portland. The Artemis Country Club looked like a car dealership for people who buy vehicles based on how glossy the paint looks under ballroom chandeliers. Inside, a live band kept playing like nothing was wrong. People were still laughing and sipping champagne, and yet in the middle of all that glitter, a man in a tuxedo was turning blue while the woman next to him screamed for help. I dropped beside him, called for epinephrine, oxygen, and within moments his breathing eased, the color returned, and the applause from the wealthy crowd was the most awkward sound I'd heard in weeks. I stood up, peeled my gloves off, ready to speak to whoever was in charge, and then I saw him. At the far end of the ballroom stood a man in a perfectly tailored tux, a rose pinned to his lapel, the chandelier light catching his profile just right. And in that instant, my heart flipped upside down because I knew that face. I had memorized it 15 years ago. I whispered his name. David. And he turned, confused, and told me I had the wrong man. His name, he said, was Eric Miller. But no, it couldn't be. He even had the same birthmark. Yet, before I could explain, I was thrown out of the ballroom and into the rain like I was crazy. And as I stood there, soaked, staring at the glowing windows, one thought hit me hard. Ghosts don't usually wear wedding rings. Or answer to a different name. Right? Because if that was David, then someone had rewritten his entire life without me. I drove home that night with rain still painting the windshield, but I barely noticed the road. My head wasn't in the city. It was back in that ballroom, staring at a man who shouldn't exist. My apartment was quiet when I walked in, too quiet. The kind where you hear your own heartbeat and can't decide if it's still steady or trying to punch its way out of your chest. My old cat Murch stretched on the armrest like he'd been expecting me, but even his lazy greeting didn't pull me back to earth. I tossed my soaked jacket over a chair and sat on the couch, elbows on my knees, staring at nothing and everything. Because how do you explain seeing someone you loved and buried in your heart 15 years ago, alive, well, and marrying someone else? The memories didn't just return, they ambushed me. The shape of his smile, the tilt of his head, that faint scar under his chin. I could almost hear him laugh like he used to, the way it softened when he was trying to pretend he wasn't nervous before a performance. I finally got up, went to the closet, and pulled down a shoebox wrapped in a faded ribbon. I hadn't opened it in years. It held the pieces of a life I'd convinced myself I'd moved past. Movie ticket stubs from cheap student dates, a silver ring I was once ready to wear forever, and Polaroids that still smelled like summer if I let myself pretend. I spread them out on the coffee table like a crime scene. There he was, David Miller, 19, grinning at me like the world was ours to outrun. I remembered how we met at a campus blood drive of all places. I was volunteering. He came in late, grumbling about missing class. We joked, and by the end of the week, we were inseparable. I used to think the universe had written us in ink. Turns out some stories are drafted in pencil. We burned too fast, too bright. One jealousy-fueled argument in our second year pulled everything apart. I thought he cheated. He thought I didn't trust him. Words flew, apologies didn't. He moved out of town with his mother soon after. I wrote, but silence became its own answer. Life rolled forward without him. I trained as a paramedic, married a decent dentist whose love felt like a business transaction, and divorced just as quietly. Yet now, staring at those pictures in the half-light, the truth hit me. I hadn't moved on. I'd just gotten good at hiding the bruise. And the man I saw tonight didn't just look like David. He was David. Or someone wearing his face. The next morning, Portland woke up washed clean. The storm had moved on, leaving puddles on the streets and sunlight bouncing off glass like the city was trying too hard to look innocent. I sat in my car in front of a sleek corporate building, Rose Crown Confections, drumming nervous fingers against the steering wheel. The kind of place where the concrete, the windows, and the logo all cost more than my annual salary. I kept telling myself I was here because I needed clarity, because maybe my brain had confused a moment, a memory, a face I desperately wanted to see. But then I stepped out, walked to the directory beside the front door, and there it was, in beautiful professional lettering. Eric Miller, Operations Manager. Same last name, same jawline, same man. And suddenly, what I thought was madness the night before didn't feel like madness anymore. It felt like destiny, knocking with both fists. Inside, the receptionist gave me that look people reserve for strangers and scrubs who show up uninvited. But when I said I was the medic from the incident at the wedding, her posture shifted just enough to show interest rather than suspicion. "One moment," she said, disappearing through a glass door. Moments later, he appeared. Seeing him under fluorescent sunlight instead of ballroom chandeliers didn't make it easier. If anything, it made everything sharper. His posture, his cautious expression, the way he stood like someone trained not to let strangers too close. He said, "You're the medic from last night." Polite, but guarded. I nodded and asked if we could talk privately. He hesitated, but finally motioned toward a quiet corner of the lobby. My hands were shaking when I pulled the old Polaroid from my bag. The photo wasn't perfect. The colors had faded, the corners were bent, but the young man in it looked identical to the one standing in front of me. He studied it in silence. Then he said the words that made my stomach drop. "This looks like me." But then he followed with the ones that took the floor out from under me. "I've never seen this picture before." I explained, my voice shaking but determined, that the man in the photo was named David Miller, my first love, the boy who vanished 15 years ago. His face softened with something real, something uncertain. He murmured, "I don't have a brother, at least not that I know of. My parents would have told me." I told him about the birthmark behind David's right ear, the crescent-shaped one he used to joke about, and slowly, he lifted his hand and touched the exact same spot. His expression changed, shock dawning behind his eyes like he had just discovered a crack in the walls he'd lived behind his whole life. He said he'd ask his parents. He needed answers too. And then he walked away, leaving me standing in a candy company lobby with one undeniable truth. I hadn't seen a ghost. I'd seen a mystery wearing the face of the man I still loved. But some truths don't just uncover the past. They blow open the present and destroy what you thought you knew. Eric drove home that night with the weight of someone else's life on his shoulders. I wasn't there to see it, but when he told me later, I could picture it. The highway lights stretching into long white lines, the world outside just a blur while his thoughts chased themselves in circles. Because if the man in that photo was real, then everything he'd been told about his own identity wasn't just incomplete, it was cracked. He walked into a quiet house on the edge of Portland, the kind with curtains that never opened all the way and rooms that held conversations no one wanted to repeat. His mother, Helen Miller, sat knitting by the window, chamomile tea steaming nearby, like she was living in a postcard. He didn't even take off his coat before asking the question that started unraveling everything. Was I ever a twin? She froze. Not blinked, not gasped. Froze, like someone had hit pause on her entire body. When she finally spoke, her voice was paper thin. Why would you ask that? And then he told her about the picture, about the girl who claims she knew the boy in it, about seeing a face identical to his staring back from a memory 15 years old. By the time he finished, his mother wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring straight into a past she had hoped was gone for good. And then she broke. Yes, she said. He had a brother. Born the same night, in the same hospital, identical twins. But there had been a fire in the maternity ward. Records destroyed, nurses scattered, chaos ruling the night. When the smoke cleared, one baby was missing. The hospital dismissed it as an error, maybe a mix-up, maybe theft. His father refused to believe it. They searched for months, but the flames hadn't just destroyed the nursery, they destroyed the trail. And instead of living in grief, the family decided to bury it, erase it, raise Eric as an only child, hoping he'd never look for what he'd lost. Eric was furious, not in the shouting, throwing chairs kind of way, but the quiet way that eats through the center of you. He asked how she could live with that kind of secret. She said she wanted to protect him, that sometimes the past is better left untouched. But he didn't buy that. How could he? Because somewhere out there, his brother had lived an entire life without him. He stepped outside before he said something he'd regret. And as the porch light flickered behind him, he pulled out his phone and dialed me. His voice was tight, strained, trembling in all the ways he was trying not to show. Eric, Julia, my mother admitted it. I had a twin, and he disappeared the night we were born. That was the moment everything changed. Because if a man could vanish as a newborn, then who took him, and why, and what else were they hiding? 2 days later, Eric and I sat across from each other in a tiny cafe tucked between old brick warehouses in Portland's Pearl District. The rain had returned, because of course it had, and the windows were dotted with cold beads of water that slid down like teardrops from the sky. We hadn't slept much. He had spent 2 days replaying his mother's confession, and I had spent the same 2 days staring at that old Polaroid, wondering how close I had come to losing someone twice. The coffees between us went untouched, steam curling up like our patience burning away. Eric finally said he'd called in a recommendation, a private investigator, someone who used to be a detective before the badge got too heavy. His name was Peter Harland, and if his voice on the phone was anything to go by, he was the kind of man who didn't waste time on fairy tales unless they left footprints. And this mystery had plenty. Peter's office was exactly what you'd imagine. Dim light, dusty files stacked everywhere, the faint buzz of an ancient air conditioner trying its best He listened as we told him everything, from the hospital fire 15 years ago, to the missing newborn, to the face I saw at the wedding. No interruptions, no raised eyebrows, just quiet calculation. When we finished, he leaned back and said he'd start with hospital archives and birth records. We should be ready, he warned, because if a hospital covered up something that big, the truth might be just as messy. Weeks passed, with nothing but silence. I went to work, bandaged wounds, stopped bleeding, stabilized strangers, but my mind was never fully in the ambulance. Every buzz of my phone twisted my stomach. Then finally, the call came. Eric's voice was tight. He found something. We met Harlan back at the cafe. The rain was softer this time, almost gentle, but his face wasn't. He dropped a file on the table like a verdict. The fire had happened exactly like Eric's mother described. Records confirmed twin boys born that night. One listed as deceased, but, and here was the gut punch, there was no death certificate. None. And the surviving infant had been transferred without a signature. After that, the trail vanished for 15 years. Until, out of nowhere, a man named David Newer surfaced in Spokane, Washington. Same birth date, same features. He had built a life, married a woman named Claire Evans, worked as a professional stunt writer, lived loud enough for 2 people. But life can be cruel. A year earlier, he and his wife had died in a highway crash. No surviving immediate family. Except they had a daughter. A 3-year-old girl named Emily, currently in the foster system here in Portland. My heart stopped. David was gone, but a part of him was still alive. And once you learn someone you've loved has a child, you can't just walk away, especially when they're alone in the world.
The next morning, I parked outside the Multnomah County Family Services building with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The building itself looked painfully normal. Bright murals, friendly posters, glass doors meant to feel welcoming. But all I could think was that behind those walls sat a child who had lost everyone she knew. A child who carried David's blood. A little piece of the life he never got to share with me. I took the folder Harlan had given us, records, case numbers, printed proof that this wasn't just grief-induced imagination, and stepped inside. The lobby had that familiar institutional scent of printers, carpet cleaner, and strained patients. Caseworkers answered phones, parents paced, children clutched stuffed animals and lollipops, trying to be brave. And I walked toward the reception desk like the ground beneath me wasn't entirely solid. When I asked to see Emily Miller, the caseworker behind the desk gave me a polite smile and asked the one question I had been dreading. "Are you a legal relative?" I opened my mouth, stammered, and finally said no, not legally. And the smile faded instantly. Rules are rules. Policies are policies. The woman told me gently that without legal proof of kinship, I couldn't see her. And I felt the air leave my lungs. I had prepared for heartbreak, but not for a door slammed shut before I could even knock properly. Then, just as the woman began to apologize, a voice spoke behind me. "She's with me." Eric, standing in the doorway, reins still clinging to his coat, eyes determined. He stepped forward, handed the caseworker his ID, and introduced himself. Eric Miller, next of kin, the last surviving brother. And just like that, everything shifted. Within minutes, we were led down a hallway with pastel murals, cartoon houses, bright suns, painted for comfort. It didn't work. My heart was doing the kind of pounding that only happens when your life is about to change and you know it. Finally, the caseworker opened the door to a small playroom. There she was. Emily, 3 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor, building the world's crookedest wooden block tower. Light brown hair and a loose braid, blue eyes too big for her little face. David's eyes. She looked up, curious rather than frightened. Children can sense something in the air before adults even register it. She stood, walked straight toward me, and without hesitation wrapped her tiny arms around my neck. And then she said one word that hit me like a punch I never saw coming. Mom? I froze. All the air disappeared. Tears I'd been holding back for 15 years finally broke loose. I wasn't her mother, but she somehow knew or felt that she was safe. And in that moment, I realized fate wasn't subtle. It didn't leave breadcrumbs. It just dropped a child into your arms and waited to see what you would do next. Because the moment you hold a child who should have been yours, walking away stops being an option.
While I was learning how to hold on to something new, Eric was learning how to let something go. The Montgomery estate sat on the edge of the city like it was built to be admired from a distance. Huge, cold, and expensive. The kind of house that looked happiness from the outside, but echoed on the inside. And that night, he walked into those marble halls, knowing he wasn't walking back out the same man. Olivia Montgomery, his wife, came in just after midnight, smelling of champagne and cigarette smoke, her heels clicking like she was announcing herself. She tossed her clutch onto the nearest countertop, not even looking at him, and said, "Don't start." That was how they spoke these days, like two tired lawyers negotiating who got custody of the silence. Eric told her he wasn't starting anything, but maybe she could tell him where she'd been. She laughed. The kind of laugh people use when they want a sound to stab someone. At a party. Where else? Some of us still enjoy life. She wasn't cruel just to be cruel. She was cruel because she thought it would keep the world from seeing how hollow she was inside. And then she went for the one wound she knew was still healing. She mocked the fact that Eric had been digging into his brother's disappearance, that he'd been meeting with the medic girl, as she called me, whispering like it was some scandal she could trade for power. Maybe, she said, he preferred tragedy to joy. Maybe he should have married me instead. Eric didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He simply stood, looked at her, and said, "Maybe I should have." And in that sentence, the marriage ended. Not in divorce papers or lawyers, just complete honesty spoken too late. Olivia threatened him in the way rich people do, by reminding him everything he had was tied to her family. Her father had already warned him, leave, and he'd lose the cars, the accounts, the business connections, every shiny thing that made this life look successful on paper. And Eric just nodded. Because none of it mattered anymore. Not after learning he had a brother who'd lived and died without him. Not after meeting a little girl who was suddenly his only surviving family. He packed one suitcase, just one, and walked out while Olivia's voice chased him down the hallway. She yelled that he was nothing without them. And maybe once that would have scared him. But that night, it didn't land at all. Because he was finally done being the man they built and ready to become the man he should have been all along. He drove through the rain and ended up on my doorstep, suitcase in hand, eyes exhausted but lighter somehow. I opened the door before he even knocked. He asked if he could stay. I didn't need words. I just stepped aside and let him in. Because love doesn't always arrive at the right time, but sometimes it returns when you're finally ready. A year passed, not with fireworks and dramatic changes, but with the slow, quiet rhythm of a life finally settling into place. The small apartment that once echoed with silence now hummed with the chaos of toys on the rug, laughter drifting down the hallway, and Sunday mornings that smelled like pancakes because Emily insisted they were the breakfast of superheroes. And honestly, after everything we'd been through, I wasn't going to argue with her logic. Eric got a modest new job at a logistics firm. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make anyone gasp at a dinner party, but he came home smiling instead of numb. And that alone was worth more than the salary he'd walked away from. I cut back my EMS shifts, not because I stopped loving the work, but because life finally offered me something to come home to, something worth being present for, something that looked suspiciously like happiness. But the biggest change came in a single envelope. It was sitting on the kitchen counter on a calm Tuesday morning, plain, white, official looking, the kind of envelope that usually delivers problems. My hands trembled when I picked it up. When I opened it and saw the word approved in bold type, the air left my lungs. Adoption finalized. Emily Miller, now Emily Dawson, was officially ours. I didn't even realize I was crying until Eric pulled me into his arms, whispering, "We did it. She's home for good." Emily, sitting cross-legged on the floor, coloring a dinosaur that looked like a goat on stilts, asked, "Does that mean I stay forever?" And I knelt beside her, pulled her into a hug, and told her, "Forever and ever." That night, we celebrated the way real families do, not with champagne fountains or catered spreads, but with pizza straight from the box, a half-melted ice cream cake, and a toddler blowing out candles like she was training for the Olympics. And in the soft glow of cheap birthday candles, I realized something. Life had finally given back everything it had once taken away. Not the same way, not with the same man, but with the same love, grown bigger, steadier, and less afraid. Months rolled forward, and the rhythm of our days became a kind of music. Work, school, bedtime stories. Eric falling asleep on the couch with a children's book on his chest, and me tucking a small blanket over both of them because my heart couldn't hold the tenderness of the moment. And slowly, without either of us noticing, our life stopped being something we were rebuilding and became something entirely new. But just when we thought our story had reached its soft, peaceful ending, life handed us a twist none of us ever saw coming. Spring arrived quietly, the kind of Portland spring that still smelled like wet pavement and pine needles. Our little apartment had settled into a rhythm. Breakfast chaos at 7 a.m., school drop-offs, work shifts, bedtime stories, cartoons playing way too loud on Saturday mornings. I'd never been happier to be tired. But then something strange began happening, something I didn't recognize at first. I started waking up nauseous. Not, "I ate too much pizza last night" nauseous. This was a deeper kind of exhaustion, the kind that didn't go away with coffee or sleep. At first, I brushed it off. Long shifts, stress, maybe I was catching a seasonal bug. But one morning at the EMS station, while I was scribbling paperwork with a cup of stale break room coffee, Zena looked at me the way women do when they already know the answer you haven't said out loud. "When was your last cycle?" she asked bluntly. I laughed. Actually laughed out loud. I told her she was crazy. I'd been diagnosed years ago. Infertility wasn't a maybe. It was stamped into my medical record like a legal ruling. Pregnancy wasn't in the cards. Not ever. Zena didn't blink. She pulled a small dox out of her locker and handed it to me with the confidence of a woman placing a bet she knew she'd win. "Humor me," she said. I threw the test into my bag and didn't even think about it again until that night when Emily was asleep, Eric was showering, and the quiet of the house gave me too much space to think. I dug the box out, stared at it for a good 2 minutes, then finally went into the bathroom and took the test. I didn't even have time to pace before the results appeared. 2 pink lines. Not faint, not questionable, clear as sunrise. I sat on the edge of the tub staring, air gone from my chest. I think I whispered, "No way," more times than I breathed. By the time Eric walked out, I handed him the test without a word. He stared at it, looked at me, stared at it again, and then laughed, the stunned, emotional laugh that cracked open something deep inside him. "You're kidding," he whispered. I shook my head. The doctor confirmed it the next morning. 16 weeks. 16. As in the middle of a miracle I never thought I'd have. We told Emily that night, and she just smiled and asked if she could teach the baby how to draw dinosaurs that look like goats. And as I held her and Eric wrapped his arms around us, it hit me. Life wasn't just giving me second chances. It was rebuilding the family I once thought I'd lost forever. But happiness has funny timing, because just as we were celebrating new life, the past showed up again on a trail in Forest Park.
Forest Park had always been my escape, long before life found its way back to me. The towering trees, the cool air, the sound of birds hidden somewhere in the branches. It was the one place in Portland where the world didn't feel rushed. And on that bright afternoon, it felt like the perfect place for the four of us, me, Eric, Emily, and little Matthew tucked snugly in his stroller, to just exist without the weight of the past pressing against our ribs. Emily skipped a few steps ahead, humming off key, but with enough joy to make the forest itself smile. Eric walked beside me, holding a thermos of coffee the way a dad who finally sleeps through the night might hold a trophy. I wasn't thinking about what we had survived or what had led us here. I was just breathing, enjoying, living. The wheels rolled softly over the dirt path, and for once, nothing was urgent. We walked until the trail opened into a small clearing overlooking the Willamette River. The afternoon sun spilled across the trees, turning everything gold. Emily climbed onto a rock, stretching her arms wide like she was claiming the whole forest as ours. "This is our place!" she shouted. And I laughed. She was right. Somehow life had brought us right where we were meant to be. I leaned into Eric's shoulder and whispered, "Who would have thought all this could come from something so broken?" He squeezed my hand and said something I will never forget. "Sometimes life doesn't take away. It just rearranges things until they fit." And he was right. David was gone, and that hurt would always exist in some quiet corner of my heart. But somehow, through grief and searches and second chances, life had given me a family that was made of every piece I thought I'd lost. A daughter who'd needed someone to choose her, a man who finally chose himself, a new baby I had been told I'd never hold. Maybe not everything returns the way you want it to, but sometimes it comes back in the way you actually need. I was lost in that thought when I saw a familiar figure standing at the tree line. Silver hair, expensive coat, posture that once radiated power. Richard Montgomery, Olivia's father. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He just stood there, shoulders heavier, watching us. And for a moment, I saw the truth. He wasn't angry anymore. Just a man who realized that all his wealth had never bought what his son-in-law had found freely: love, belonging, and peace. He gave a small nod, almost a bow, then turned and walked away. Emily ran back and grabbed my hand. "Mama, can we come here again tomorrow?" I zipped up her jacket, kissed her temple, and said, "As long as you want." And as we headed back down the trail, with Eric adjusting Matthew's blanket and the sound of our daughter's laughter echoing through the trees, I finally understood what my life had been trying to teach me all along. Some stories don't end with the people you started with. They end with the people who stay.